The staff officers gathered around General James Wolfe in his headquarters on the Isle d'Orléans, stared at their commander like he had lost his mind. It was early September 1759, and Wolfe had just outlined his plan to capture Quebec, the fortress city that had defied British attempts at conquest for 3 months of brutal campaigning. The plan was audacious to the point of madness. Land troops in darkness at the base of 175-foot cliffs, scale those cliffs at night while carrying muskets, ammunition, and equipment, overwhelm the small French guard at the top before they could raise the alarm, deploy thousands of men in battle formation on open ground before dawn, hold that ground against a French army that outnumbered them, and wait for the French to attack. Any one of a dozen things could go wrong, and if they did, the entire British army could be destroyed, trapped on cliff tops with no line of retreat, except back down the cliffs under French fire. It was the kind of plan that should never work, the kind of operation that military academies would later use as an example of what not to do. Except it worked, against all odds, despite incredible risks. In defiance of reasonable military planning, the British executed what became known as the assault on the Anons-sous-Foulon, scaled the cliffs to the Plains of Abraham, forced a battle that lasted 15 minutes, and captured Quebec. This operation, this impossible cliff assault, won Canada for Britain, eliminated France from North America, and changed the course of world history. It succeeded because Wolfe was desperate enough to try it, because his subordinates planned it carefully despite their doubts, because British soldiers executed it with skill and courage, and because the French made critical mistakes at every stage. This is the story of how Britain planned and executed the impossible. Quebec City in 1759 was the strongest fortress in North America, and one of the most naturally defensible positions on the continent. Founded by Samuel de Champlain in 1608, the city sat on a bluff overlooking the St. Anna, Lawrence River at a point where the river narrowed dramatically to less than a mile wide. The city itself was divided into upper and lower towns. The lower town, at river level, was the commercial heart with warehouses, docks, and merchant houses. The upper town, perched on cliffs 175 to 300 feet above the river, was the administrative and military center, protected by stone walls and bastions built and reinforced over 150 years. The cliffs were not vertical, but they were steep enough that climbing them, especially under fire, would be nearly impossible for an attacking force. The French had artillery batteries positioned to command the river, making any approach by ship suicidal. On the landward side to the east, where the terrain was more accessible, the Marquis de Montcalm had concentrated his main army in fortified positions at Beauport, entrenchments that stretched for miles, and were protected by natural ravines and tidal flats. Quebec seemed impregnable, and capturing it seemed to require either an impossibly long siege or a suicidal frontal assault. The British government recognized that Quebec was the key to Canada. Montreal could not hold. If Quebec fell, because Quebec controlled the St. Lawrence River, the only practical supply route from France, if Quebec could be taken, all of New France would collapse like a house of cards. In 1759, Britain committed enormous resources to the campaign. A massive fleet under Admiral Charles Saunders, including 49 warships and transports carrying thousands of troops, was assembled. Command of the land forces was given to Major General James Wolfe, a 32-year-old officer who had distinguished himself in previous campaigns, but had never commanded an operation of this scale. Wolfe was given approximately 8,500 regular troops, mostly British regiments, plus some American Rangers and light infantry. His orders were simple and daunting: capture Quebec. The fleet arrived before Quebec in late June 1759, having successfully navigated the treacherous Saint-Tencio Lawrence River, a feat many had considered impossible for such a large fleet. French river pilots had been captured and persuaded to guide the fleet, and British naval expertise handled the rest. The arrival of the fleet was itself a strategic shock to the French, who had not believed the British could bring such a force up the river. But arrival and conquest were two different things. Wolfe now faced the problem of how to actually take the city. He established camps on the Isle d'Orléans, in the middle of the river, and on the south bank at Point Levis, giving him positions from which to bombard the city and observe French defenses. But observation only confirmed what he already knew. Quebec was extraordinarily difficult to attack. Wolfe's first strategy was to bombard Quebec into submission. British artillery batteries on Point Levis, directly across the river from the city, began a systematic bombardment in July. For weeks, British guns fired on Quebec, reducing much of the lower town to rubble, starting fires, destroying buildings, killing civilians and soldiers. The bombardment was devastating psychologically and caused significant damage, but it did not crack the city's defenses or force surrender. The French endured the bombardment, repaired what damage they could, and waited. The upper town, on its high bluff and protected by walls, was largely immune to bombardment from across the river. The bombardment was hurting Quebec, but not conquering it. Wolfe's next attempt was a direct assault on the French positions at Beauport. On July 31st, British forces launched an amphibious attack on the French entrenchments east of Quebec. The plan was to land troops on the shore at low tide, advance across the tidal flats, and storm the French positions. The attack was a disaster. The landing was poorly coordinated. Troops came ashore in confusion. The whole French positions were stronger than expected, with artillery and infantry firing down on the British from protected entrenchments. British soldiers advancing across open ground and tidal flats were cut down in droves. Some units reached the French positions and tried to climb the entrenchments, but they were repulsed with heavy casualties. Wolfe called off the attack after losing over 400 men killed and wounded with nothing to show for it. The French had held easily, confirming that frontal assaults on their prepared positions were futile. By early August, Wolfe was in crisis. He had been campaigning for over a month with nothing to show but casualties and frustration. His army was weakening from disease, particularly dysentery and fever that swept through the camps. British strength was dropping daily as men died or became too sick to fight. The campaign season was running out. The fleet would have to leave the St. Lawrence by mid-October at the latest, before the river began to freeze. If Quebec did not fall soon, the entire campaign would fail. Wolfe would return to Britain in disgrace, his reputation destroyed, having accomplished nothing despite commanding the largest British force ever assembled in North America. The pressure was enormous, and Wolfe, never in the best health, became seriously ill himself in late August, probably from a combination of stress, exhaustion, and camp fever. While Wolfe was sick, his three brigadiers Robert Monckton, James Murray, and George Townshend took it upon themselves to develop alternative plans. The brigadiers had been increasingly frustrated with Wolfe's leadership, feeling that he was fixated on direct assaults that could not succeed, and that he was not sharing his thinking with his subordinates. But with Wolfe temporarily incapacitated, they had an opportunity to propose something different. They looked at the map of Quebec and the surrounding area, and focused on the terrain upstream from the city to the west. West of Quebec, the cliffs along the north shore of the St. Lawrence continued for miles, but they were not continuously guarded. The French had limited manpower and could not defend every foot of shoreline. Most French forces were concentrated at Beauport to the east, or in Quebec itself. West of the city, there was a detached force under Colonel Bougainville, about 3,000 men, tasked with patrolling the shoreline and responding to any British landing attempts, but Bougainville's force could not be everywhere at once. If British troops could land somewhere along this western shore, climb the cliffs, and reach the plains of Abraham, the open ground just west of Quebec's walls, they could force Montcalm to come out and fight. More importantly, a British force on the plains of Abraham would cut the road between Quebec and Montreal, severing Quebec's supply line and communication with the rest of Canada. Montcalm would have to respond, and that response would give the British the battle they needed. The brigadiers proposed this western strategy to Wolfe when he recovered enough to resume command in early September. Wolfe was skeptical at first, but he had no better alternative. Every other approach had failed. The direct assault at Beauport had been repulsed. The bombardment had not forced surrender. Raids up and down the river had accomplished nothing except burning Canadian farms. A campaign of terror that had hardened French and Canadian resolve without bringing military victory. Time was running out. The Western strategy was risky, but it was the only option that offered any chance of success. Wolfe accepted the plan, but with modifications. He would choose the specific landing site and the timing. The operation would be his, executed under his command, and if it failed, the responsibility would be his alone. Wolfe and his staff studied the western shore carefully, using telescopes to observe from ships and from positions across the river. They were looking for a place where troops could land, and where there was a path up the cliffs that could be climbed at night. They identified several possible sites. The Anse au Foulon, later known as Wolfe's Cove, was one possibility. It was about 2 miles upstream from Quebec. There was a narrow beach at the base of the cliffs where boats could land. French maps and intelligence from deserters indicated there was a path, steep and difficult but passable, leading up the cliffs from the cove. The path was guarded, but intelligence suggested the guard was small, perhaps 100 men or less. If British troops could land in darkness, overwhelm the guard quietly, and start climbing before the alarm was raised, they might get enough men to the top to secure the position before French reinforcements could arrive. The plan that emerged was extraordinarily complex and dependent on dozens of factors beyond British control. The operation would happen at night to achieve surprise. British troops would board boats after dark and drift downstream with the tide toward the landing site. They would land at the Anse au Foulon before dawn. A light infantry advance party would climb first, overwhelm the French guard as quietly as possible, and secure the path. Then the main body would climb, company by company, regiment by regiment, until the entire force was on top of the cliffs. The troops would form up in battle formation on the plains of Abraham as quickly as possible. Light guns would be dragged up the cliffs to provide artillery support. The army would deploy and wait for the French response. If everything worked perfectly, Wolfe would have his army on favorable ground, ready to fight the kind of conventional battle that British troops excelled at. But so many things could go wrong. The boats might be detected during the approach, giving the French time to prepare defenses or ambush the landing. The tides and currents of the St. Lawrence were tricky, and the boats might miss the landing site in darkness, ending up at the wrong place or being swept downstream past Quebec. The French guard at the top of the cliffs might be larger or more alert than intelligence suggested, and they might fight effectively, stopping the British advance before it got started. The path up the cliffs might be blocked, or too steep to climb while carrying equipment, or might not even exist where the British thought it did. French reinforcements might arrive quickly, catching British troops strung out on the cliff path before they could form up properly. Montcalm might not take the bait, might choose to stay in his fortifications, rather than come out to fight. Any of these failures would result in catastrophe, with the British force destroyed or forced to retreat back down the cliffs under fire. Wolfe was fully aware of the risks. He wrote letters to his mother and to his fiancée that read like goodbye notes, making arrangements for his affairs in case he did not survive. He was not being melodramatic. He genuinely understood that this operation was desperate and that failure was more likely than success. But he also understood that doing nothing guaranteed failure. Quebec would not fall to bombardment or to time. A direct assault on Beauport was suicidal and had already failed. The only chance, however slim, was this audacious night landing and cliff assault. Wolfe decided to take that chance because the alternative was to sail home, having accomplished nothing. The deception plan was as important as the assault plan itself. The British needed the French to be looking in the wrong direction when the assault happened. To achieve this, the British maintained active pressure at Beauport. Ships positioned off Beauport made movements suggesting another assault was coming. British camps at Point Levis remained active with visible activity. The goal was to keep Montcalm focused on defending Beauport, while the real attack came from the west. Additionally, British ships had been moving up and down the river west of Quebec, for weeks, making false landing attempts, keeping Bougainville's force running back and forth along the shore, responding to threats that never materialized. The British wanted Bougainville exhausted and his men spread thin, unable to concentrate force at any one point. The deception worked better than the British could have hoped. Montcalm remained convinced that any serious British attack would come at Beauport. He kept the bulk of his army there, ready to repel another assault. The operation was scheduled for the night of September 12 to 13. Wolfe issued detailed orders to his commanders. Brigadier Monckton would command the first wave, approximately 1,700 men, in the initial landing. Marie and Townshend would follow with additional troops. The light infantry companies, the best trained and most agile troops, would form the advance party to climb first and clear the path. Each soldier was issued 24 rounds of ammunition and 2 days of rations. They were ordered to maintain absolute silence during the approach and landing. No one was to fire unless fired upon. The watchword was victory, and the countersign was Quebec. These passwords would help identify friend from foe in the darkness and confusion. As darkness fell on September 12th, British troops began boarding boats at their embarkation points upstream from the city. This was a vulnerable moment. If the French detected the embarkation, they could raise the alarm and prepare defenses. But the night was quiet, and the embarkation proceeded without incident. Around 2 a.m. on September 13th, the boats cast off and began drifting downstream with the tide. Wolfe himself was in one of the lead boats with the light infantry. The flotilla moved silently down the dark river, carrying approximately 4,800 men toward their objective. The boats stayed close to the north shore, using the darkness and the shoreline to avoid detection. French sentries were stationed along the shore, but in the darkness, the boats were nearly invisible. The only sounds were the lapping of water and the occasional creak of oars when boats needed to adjust position. As the boats approached the landing area, they encountered French sentries, who called out a challenge in French. French supply boats were expected that night, bringing provisions to Quebec from upstream positions. A British officer who spoke fluent French, possibly Captain Fraser of the 78th Highlanders, or another officer, called back in French that they were the provision boats coming downstream. This deception bought crucial seconds. The sentries, satisfied with the answer, or at least uncertain enough not to fire, let the boats continue. The lead boats reached the cove at Anse-au-Foulon, and the troops began scrambling ashore around 4 a.m., still under cover of darkness, though dawn was approaching. The cliff loomed above them, a dark mass rising into the night sky. The beach was narrow, barely enough room for the boats to land and the troops to form up. The light infantry, about 400 men in the first wave, immediately began looking for the path up the cliffs. They found it, a narrow, steep track that switchbacked up the cliff face. Lieutenant Colonel William Howe, commanding the light infantry, led his men upward. This was the most dangerous moment of the entire operation. The men were climbing a steep path in near darkness, exposed on the cliff face, unable to defend themselves effectively. If the French guard at the top was alert and fought well, they could shoot down into the British troops and turn the cliff path into a killing ground. But the French guard was not alert. The sentry post at the top of the cliffs was manned by about 100 militia under Captain Louis Dupont du Chambon de Vergor. The guard was supposed to watch for British landing attempts, but they had been doing this for weeks with no serious threat materializing. They were tired, probably half asleep, and certainly not expecting a major assault at 4 a.m. When they heard noise below and saw shapes moving on the cliff, they initially thought it might be French troops, or possibly deserters. By the time they realized it was a British assault, the light infantry was nearly at the top. The French guard fired a ragged volley down the cliff, wounding some British soldiers, but not stopping the advance. The light infantry stormed the position at the top, overwhelming the French in a brief, violent struggle. Vergor himself was wounded and captured. Some of his men fled, running toward Quebec to raise the alarm. Others were killed or captured. Within minutes, the British controlled the top of the cliffs, and the path was secure. With the path secured, the rest of the British force began climbing. This was a grueling physical task. Each soldier had to climb nearly 200 feet of steep cliff path, while carrying a musket weighing about 10 pounds, a cartridge box with ammunition, a haversack with rations, and other equipment. The path was rough, sometimes little more than a goat track, and in places soldiers had to pull themselves up by grabbing roots, branches, or the hands of soldiers who had gone before them, but they climbed steadily, company after company, regiment after regiment. Officers pushed their men, maintaining order and discipline despite the exhaustion. As each unit reached the top, they were directed to assembly areas on the Plains of Abraham, where they formed into line. The operation that had seemed impossible was actually working. As dawn broke on September 13th, General Wolfe stood on the Plains of Abraham with approximately 4,500 men formed in battle line. More troops were still climbing the cliffs, and Wolfe sent word for them to hurry. Light artillery pieces were being manhandled up the cliff path, a nearly superhuman feat that required teams of men dragging guns weighing hundreds of pounds up terrain that infantry had found challenging. The Plains of Abraham stretched before the British Army, open ground that was perfect for the kind of linear warfare that British troops had trained for their entire careers. To the east, less than a mile away, were the walls of Quebec. To the west, the British rear was protected by rough ground and woods. The British had achieved their objective. They were on the plains, deployed for battle, and the French would have to respond. The risks were not over. The British position was still precarious. They had limited ammunition because everything had to be carried up the cliffs. They had only a few light cannons with limited shot and powder. They were outnumbered by the total French forces available, though those forces were scattered. If the French mounted a coordinated attack from multiple directions, using Montcalm's main army from Beauport, Bougainville's force from the west, and the Quebec garrison, they could overwhelm the British. If the French simply waited, refusing to attack, the British position would become untenable, because they lacked the supplies for a long siege and French reinforcements could arrive. Everything depended on Montcalm's decision, and Montcalm made the worst decision possible. He decided to attack immediately. When Montcalm received word that British troops were on the Plains of Abraham, he rode out from Beauport to see for himself. He could have waited for Bougainville's force to arrive from the west, creating a two-front attack. He could have waited to bring up his full force from Beauport, including his best troops and artillery. He could have coordinated with the Quebec garrison to attack the British from multiple directions. Instead, he decided to attack immediately with approximately 4,500 men, roughly equal to Wolfe's force, giving the British the conventional battle they wanted on terms favorable to British tactics. This decision has been debated for over 250 years, but the consensus is that it was wrong. Montcalm gave away his advantages and played to British strength. The battle itself lasted approximately 15 minutes from the first French advance to their final collapse. Montcalm's army, a mix of French regulars and Canadian militia, advanced across the plains toward the British line. They fired as they came, the standard French practice, but firing on the move at long range was ineffective. The British line stood firm, not returning fire, waiting for orders. This discipline was extraordinary. British soldiers watched the enemy advance, heard musket balls whistling past, saw comrades fall wounded, and did not break or fire prematurely. They trusted their officers and their training. At approximately 40 yards, when the French were close enough that even smoothbore muskets could not miss, Wolfe gave the order to fire. The British line erupted in the most perfect volley anyone present had ever witnessed. Thousands of muskets fired in what sounded like a single massive explosion. The effect on the French line was catastrophic. Men fell in heaps, entire ranks cut down simultaneously. Before the smoke cleared, the British reloaded with mechanical precision and fired a second volley, equally devastating. The French line, already shattered by the first volley, simply disintegrated under the second. Men broke and ran. Officers tried to rally them but failed. The British did not fire a third volley. Woe! Instead, they charged with fixed bayonets and the French army collapsed into rout. Some units maintained cohesion and conducted fighting withdrawals, but the majority fled toward Quebec or toward the bridge over the Saint Best Charles River, leading to Beauport. The battle was over. Quebec was doomed. Both commanders fell in the battle. Wolfe was hit 3 times and died on the field, knowing that he had won. Montcalm was struck by musket balls and died the next morning, knowing that he had lost. The deaths of both commanders added a romantic, tragic quality to the battle that has fascinated historians and storytellers ever since. But the real significance was strategic, not romantic. Quebec surrendered 5 days later on September 18th. Montreal fell the following year. By 1760, all of New France was in British hands. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formalized what the battle had decided, that France would give up Canada to Britain. The operation to capture Quebec, the impossible cliff assault that won Canada, succeeded because of a combination of careful planning, skillful execution, British discipline and courage, and French mistakes. The planning by Wolfe's brigadiers identified the western approach as the only viable option. Wolfe's willingness to take the risk made the operation possible. The careful reconnaissance identified the landing site and the path. The deception plan kept French forces looking in the wrong direction. The execution on the night of September 12th was nearly flawless, with troops landing at the right place, climbing the cliff successfully, and deploying before dawn. British light infantry overwhelmed the weak French guard. British regulars climbed the cliffs despite the physical challenge. British discipline in battle delivered those 2 perfect volleys that won the engagement. French mistakes at every level, from the weak guard at the cliff top to Vergor's lack of alertness to Montcalm's decision to attack immediately, allowed the British operation to succeed when it should have failed. The operation has been studied in military academies for over 2 centuries as an example of audacious planning and bold execution. It shows that sometimes the impossible plan is the right plan when all the possible plans have failed. It demonstrates the importance of surprise, of attacking where the enemy is weak rather than where they are strong, of accepting risk when the alternative is certain failure. It also shows that operations succeed or fail based on execution, that even the best plan fails if soldiers do not climb the cliffs, if officers do not maintain order, if troops do not stand firm under fire. The British soldiers who climbed those cliffs in darkness, who formed battle line under French guns, who held their fire until ordered, and then delivered those devastating volleys. Those men won Canada through their skill and courage as much as through any general's planning. The Quebec operation changed history. If it had failed, if the French guard had been alert, if the British boats had been detected, if the cliffs had proven impassable, if Montcalm had waited and coordinated his forces, the outcome would have been completely different. Quebec might have held. Canada might have remained French. North America might have developed along entirely different lines, but the operation succeeded, against all reasonable odds, because desperate men planned carefully and executed boldly, and because fortune favored the brave on that September night in 1759. The impossible became possible. The cliffs were climbed. The battle was won, and Canada fell to Britain. Operation Capture Quebec stands as one of the most audacious military operations in history, the impossible cliff assault that changed the world.